Hello and welcome to All the Games You Like Are Bad. I'm your loudmouth on the internet, Mark Begney, and today we're going to be talking about Guards of Atlantis by Artyom Nichipurov. First off, let's get some pedantry out the way. Let's not abbreviate Guards of Atlantis by presenting it as an acronym GOA, because GOA is the brilliant auction/resource management game by Rudiger Dorn. Let's not have a repeat of the terrible calamity when everyone on the internet decided that StarCraft 2 should be abbreviated SC2. SC2 is and always will be Star Control 2, the single greatest game ever made. And if you think that StarCraft should be SC2, you're just wrong. So, Guards of Atlantis is a multiplayer MOBA game, and it seeks to be a recreation of MOBA in board game form. What is MOBA? Well, it's a multiplayer online battle arena. Contrary to the claims on the back of the box of Guards of Atlanta that it's multiplayer open battle arena, because obviously you can't claim on the back of a board game box that you have an online product, because it isn't. And if you're not familiar with the genre, this is characterized by games such as League of Legends, Defense of the Ancients / Dota, Heroes of the Storm, and a number of other similar games. And they're characterized by a number of conventions. And these are that you're going to have lanes in which there are these uncontrolled minions that just go off and do their own thing to confront your opposing team's minions. And each member on the two opposing teams, each player controls a hero, which you have complete control over. The minions you don't tend to have control over, possibly even at all, but they decide much of the game's tempo. Because there's this notion of pushing lanes. When the minions meet each other, they sort of glom up and there's this massive melee. And part of MOBA games is pushing that lane, pushing that further towards your opponent's side of the base, because your goal is to get to the opponent's base and kill it. Anyway, there's lots of other details involved. The thing that you control is a hero that you typically level up, usually by killing things, or buy treasure, typically by killing things, and have detailed control over their special abilities. Anyway, this as a genre is one whose conventions fascinate me. I really like how it gets a sense of tempo, of geography, of teamwork, of specialization, this interplay between the heroes that you control completely and the minions that you don't control but are very, very consequential for the game. When I initially started to grok the way that MOBA games worked, I was immediately enthusiastic. And then I played them, and I realized that there are two fundamental problems with MOBA games, and this is why I can't play them. Number one, the time investment tends to be massive. Even the shorter ones, a match will tend to last 20 minutes, which dovetails neatly into the second problem, which is I hate playing MOBA games. I'm really, really terrible at them, and my teammates, who tend to be strangers, often from Russia, get really, really mad at me because of how bad I am. And as we all know, the internet is a terrible and unforgiving place. For example, I might show up and say your game is bad. That's a jerk thing to do. Jerks are present on the internet. And no one likes to be overwhelmed by Russians, which is somewhat appropriate given that this game was designed in Latvia, a country that is familiar with being overwhelmed by Russians. Communism jokes. They're funny because they're absolutely nightmarishly terrible. Moving on. So, when we first saw board game designs that sought to recreate some of the conventions of MOBA games, I was even more enthusiastic, because board games don't tend to have a lot of those problems, if for no other reason than a 40-minute long board game isn't all that long, so whatever. And you can play with who you want to, and you can complete control over the environment, which is why I make all my guests, when they come to play board games, when they sign NDAs and they do exactly what I tell them to do. And that's what socialization looks like, right? Now, the other major design in this design space, other than Guards of Atlantis, which is the newest one, is Rum and Bones, Cool Mini or Not's pirate-themed MOBA game. And there are a number of others hitting the market right now. Among them, Guards of Atlantis. There's also Load, League of Ancient Defenders. Haven't played that. And Mobile Wars, which hasn't hit the market yet. But I'm interested in trying all of them. I love it. I love the idea. So, let's talk about Guards of Atlantis on its own terms. So, as I said, it's a team-based game, very much like original MOBAs. You can square off with any number of players, and it has a very fascinating way of dealing with odd numbers that I'll get to later. But each team will have the same number of heroes, usually, and each player will control one of those heroes. The goal of the game is to get the minions, which you don't control, all the way to the opponent's base, which is called the throne room. Your unique heroes level up. You can kill things to go get gold, which then lets you level up and improve your abilities. And the gameplay itself is zero-luck, card-driven gameplay. Everyone has a hand of 5 cards. Each round has 4 turns. And every turn, you play one of your cards, and it resolves. Your cards can get better as you level up. That is indeed what leveling up constitutes. But it allows for a huge degree of character specialization because everything you do is driven by these cards. And there's only one card in each deck that's the same across everybody, and that's the hold card that says you do nothing. The other 4 cards tend to share some common characteristics. Everyone has a red card, which tends to be an attack. Everyone has an orange card, which also tends to be an attack, although there are some exceptions to this, and many of them work very differently. Now, the feel of the game is a very much in tone with its deterministic gameplay. It can be a very static affair, where movement is quite costly and difficult, and you need to make sure that your positioning is on point. And the game actually offers you helpful little hints at the bottom of some of the cards, and they do emphasize the necessity of positioning, because if you've got 4 turns over the course of the game, you can't, as a rule, move and attack on the same turn. Very rare are the cards that let you do that. So generally speaking, you need to move into position, and then hope by the time you attack next turn, things will be in the state that you need them to be. This is an interesting tactical challenge. More on that later. Another thing that cards often have is a variety of special abilities that might alter the game state, that might subtly manipulate minions by moving them around the board a little bit, or maybe protect your minions, or even exploit them for some other effect. Now, at the start of the game, these can be very tricky to pull off, because they tend to be weak, have low ranges, and the effects can sometimes be minimal. But it can be extremely rewarding to pull it off when you can, either because you've leveled up the ability later on, and suddenly that thing that you thought was worthless is now amazing, or because you played the game several times, or because you have a flash of insight, and you're able to get the special ability to work when you thought you wouldn't have been able to, or when it wasn't initially apparent how it might function to your advantage. This can be extremely satisfying, and again, this dovetails nicely into the very deterministic, sometimes plotting, deliberate pace of the gameplay. Now, but this leads to one of the characteristic elements of the game, and that is that there's a huge benefit to experience. Like any other no-luck deterministic game, people who've played the game before and who are more familiar with the cards, both of their own heroes and of enemy heroes, will have a distinct advantage. Whether this, as a new player, frustrates you or intrigues you, it really says more about you than the game design. I've seen people react both ways. Some people, when they see that a game really gets deeper after a second and third or fourth play, really appreciate that, and they enjoy getting their asses handed to them by somebody who's played before. Other people find it extremely frustrating and are not inclined to give it that second or third or fourth play because they don't feel like they were able to get anything done on their first play. I don't mean to say that as a new player you're going to find yourself stymied, unable to do anything, but you're frequently going to find that your targets have moved away before you can get what you want done, that you're not really able to exert your special abilities, and everyone else's special abilities seem to be triggering at inopportune times, and you're generally going to find yourself outclassed and outmaneuvered as a general rule. Again, whether that's a benefit or a detriment is really up to you. However, this is a bit of a downside. Some of the cards can be a bit confusing. The core rules of this game are relatively straightforward and approachable, but the problem is some of them don't work like you might immediately think. There are these notions of straight lines. There's a distinction between range and radius. Some of the terminology is not the most consistently applied, and suffice it to say that every game I've played where there's been a new player, sometimes even when there are experienced players who are playing new heroes, they play a card thinking based on the text that will obviously work one way, and it works in a radically different way. I don't know if this is true. I don't know if this is just an unavoidable problem by virtue of the complexity of the card effects, but it is a prevalent issue, and it does tend to show up every game, and this can lead into the sense of disappointment and frustration that new players sometimes feel. Let me talk, though, a little bit more about how it situates itself within this, within the broader board game genre and within the idea of trying to execute a MOBA in the context of a board game. And let me start by acknowledging the unpleasant truth that we all know deep in our hearts. That is that as board gamers, we have been lied to. We've been lied to repeatedly by publishers, by boxes, by manuals, and sometimes even by people who are in love with a game and can't recognize its shortcomings. I'm talking specifically here about player count. Player count is often a flagrant lie. Let me pick on a game that I actually love, but that does this to a great effect, and this is actually very relevant for comparing it to Guards of Atlantis, and that's Duel of Ages. The first edition of Duel of Ages claimed that the game could be played with, I kid you not, 2 to 16 players. This is technically true, but is really just a bald-faced lie. In order to play with 16 players, what you need to do is play a game with a minimum of 16 characters in play, and then each player plays one character. But the default game mode is 2 teams of some number of characters, and you control multiple characters. And really, this is an example of a game that is fixed fun. As you add more players, you're just divvying up the same number of actions and the same number of characters amongst more players. And that's not always terrible, but it's never ideal. Guards of Atlantis doesn't do this. As you add more players, you just add more heroes into the game. And indeed, the game with 2 players is not as fun as it is with, say, 4, 6, or 8, because teamwork and playing off of a teammate's ability is really enjoyable and part of the fun of the game. So this isn't a fixed fun game, and when it says in the box that it can be played with 2 to 9 players, it's not actually lying. 2 is not ideal, but basically, once you get past 4, it's all gravy. I was shocked at how well this game played at large player counts. Even with new players, at large player counts, this game is going to clock in at about 2 hours or less, and everyone is going to be involved. That alone is an amazing, amazing achievement. Allow me now to talk then about how it deals with odd numbers of players, because speaking personally, I don't like it in a game where I have to deal with multiple hands of cards. If you tell me to play multiple characters and I need to manage multiple decks or multiple hands of cards, that immediately breaks, number 1, the immersion, and number 2, it increases the mental strain of just keeping up with what's going on in the game and prevents me from having fun making the decisions. When I solo games, I sometimes reluctantly play multiple hands, but I prefer it when a solo game lets me just play one hand. And it definitely, if I'm going to play a multiplayer game, I don't want any player to be playing multiple decks. Especially since usually it's only one player or a couple of players that play multiple decks and everyone else plays one deck, so that asymmetry further rankles me. In the context of Guards of Atlantis, if you have an odd number of players, then what you do is you make use of the 2 8-men. And in terms of balance, the 2 8-men are roughly as efficient as a single character. So you have 2 players play those two different guys. And so you have one team with more members, but 2 of those heroes are relatively weak. Now you might think, as I suspected, that this would be markedly less enjoyable to play the weak heroes, but not so, because as I said, this is a relatively plotting, determinate, deliberative game where you need to be able to work hard to get your cards to work properly. That challenge, that sense of engagement of making sure that your cards can work the way that they were intended or the way you want them to, still exists when you're playing the weaker heroes. Sometimes the conditionals are slightly more restrictive, sometimes they're not, but at the end of the day, the same experience is roughly the same. And so with odd numbers of players, it actually works quite well, if those players are experienced. I don't think it would be a good idea to give new players the weaker characters, because it probably would be yet another element of overload for them to deal with. But I really am thoroughly impressed at how well this game scales. It's not lying to you like Duel of Ages. It's not even lying to you the way Rum and Bones is. Rum and Bones also claims to be able to support multiplayer. And you might think that because it too seeks to replicate a MOBA, which is definitionally a team-based game, that it might work. But no, really not. It's not. I mean, I like Rum and Bones, but I would never play it multiplayer. It is again a case of, well, everyone gets fewer characters and therefore fewer actions, and you don't really get that same sense of a team-based game. It's just parceling out the same amount of actions to a larger number of people. I don't recommend it. There are optional rules that exist in the game to prevent the game from dragging. Because although all my plays have clocked in at a reasonable amount of time, there is the possibility of a stalemate developing, because the way you win the game without any optional rules is by pushing the lane all the way to the opponent's base. There's the possibility of a seesaw developing, where you push the lane, then we push the lane, then you push the lane, then we push the lane. And there are ways to avoid that, and for your first plays, it's recommended that you do that, and it actually works quite decently. But as I said, I've been very surprised at how quickly it's played, and how well it's scaled. So this is actually kind of a battle party game in terms of the number that it supports, which is great. I mean, it's so flexible. You can break it out with, again, I would recommend a minimum of 4, but as people keep piling in, you can go all the way up to 9 or to 11 with the first expansion. So yeah, this game comes up to 11. It's an obligatory joke. I'm sorry. I'm contractually obligated to make that reference. My hands are tied. Now, there are some downsides. I've spoken, I think, a lot about how praiseworthy it is. Number 1, a lot of people are going to get turned off by how deterministic and how relatively plodding it is. There's some people who, when there's plastic on the board, they want to be able to jump around and do lots of crazy stuff. And that's respectable. That's reasonable. If they want to do that, then Rum and Bones is definitely the MOBA experience for them, because in Rum and Bones you have considerably more mobility. There's a lot less forward planning that you need to engage in. And people are doing wild stuff like rappelling to different ships and all that kind of stuff. A second problem is that when you die, if you are killed, there's a very painful loss of momentum. Now, this is very true to the genre. In a MOBA game, when you die, you're going to be out of the game for a considerable period of time just sitting there watching the counter go down. That doesn't necessarily make it a virtue in terms of game design, either for video games or for a board game. There's a bit of balancing in Guards of Atlantis because, generally speaking, you are more fragile the later the round goes, and when you die, you show up at the second turn of the next round. So, generally speaking, you're going to die when you lose fewer turns, but you're still going to lose turns. And the game, as I said, moves at a reasonably fast clip, but you're still going to be missing turns. And I don't really know our way around this. I mean, you could introduce variants to minimize the negative effects of dying. But it does seem to be baked into the design, and I'm not sure there's a way around it. So it's not ideal, but there it is. It's also the case that some people are not going to adapt to this notion of triaging targets. Very much like in a MOBA game, you have to decide when you're going to go after other heroes and when you're going to go after minions, because the way you attack them, although superficially similar, they have very different effects on the game state. And that is one of the many things that you're going to learn with the benefit of experience, about timing, about who to attack and when it's time to go harvest minions, and when it's time to really target a hero to try to knock them out. And that's really tricky. And it can be frustrating as a new player, either to be repeatedly ganked by the other team because they don't know when they're vulnerable, or to be in a situation where they figure, I'm going to go assassinate another player, but they don't know that they don't have the offensive capability to finish the job, or even inconvenience them in a serious way. So again, that kind of feeds into this notion that it's a game that rewards depth, and some people don't like that learning and discovery experience. I really did, and a number of players that I introduced the game to did as well. I've actually been rather surprised at some of the people who've taken very well to the game, and some people who've reacted negatively to the game. I haven't really been able to predict, based on people's other preferences, whether they're going to take to it, which is really strange and really unusual. So really, this does manage to capture a lot of the MOBA elements. You've got the team-based gameplay, the triaging of targets, this issue of momentum and geography, and interacting with the minions in substantive ways, and the leveling up, which many people is the sine qua non of the heroic MOBA experience, is done much, much better here than it is in the other MOBA clones that I've seen in terms of the rules. That was actually one of the serious complaints that I heard leveled against Rum and Bones. You don't really level up in Rum and Bones. You get money, and then that powers attacks. Now, the second edition of Rum and Bones, which is supposed to be coming out not too long after this recording, seeks to remedy that. Time will tell how successful that is. I'm curious to see what it does. But some people have reacted very negatively in that sense. But there are so many MOBA elements in this game, it really does feel like a MOBA, although, again, in a very sort of no-luck deliberative package. If that's what you're looking for, if you like those kinds of deterministic combat games, if you want something that's that flexible, that rewards a bit of experience, that has weird interactions and text effects that you want to discover, then I thoroughly recommend Guards of Atlantis. If that doesn't appeal to you, if you like chucking dice, if you think combat necessarily means an element of randomness, if you like games that are exceptionally fluid, and where you're able to react on a dime, and where you're not seriously penalized by losing turns for making a mistake, then Guards of Atlantis definitively isn't for you. And then maybe, on the other hand, all you want to do is play on League of Legends and tell people to uninstall and kill themselves. And, if that's your gig, you're wrong, but I forgive you. Thanks very much for watching, and take care.